Sapientia operibus vindicata. Wisdom is vindicated by its works. Welcome back to the Fire of Liberty podcast at Naples Classical Academy. Before I sort of jump into the whole topic of discussion today, I just want to remind you that we are a liberal arts school. So we're a school in the tradition of the West. And we're a school that is in the Barney Charter School Initiative. We're a part of the Barney Charter School Initiative, so that we work directly with Hillsdale College in Michigan. They provide our curriculum. They train our teachers. We're a member school. And so we're affiliated with them, and we're very proud of that. Happy to, I just want to say that. I'll say it, I should say it every time we get together. We're currently accepting applications for 24-25 school year. So if you're interested in the liberal arts, or I say something here that interests you, now is a good time to put your application in. We do have a bit of a waiting list, but we definitely are accepting applications. With that said, I kind of want to jump into where we've gone in the last couple of episodes, talking about the history of the liberal arts, some of the people who were involved, how it was preserved, how it's really the traditional way that man was educated. And the reason for that is because it is ordered to man's nature and to seeing his place in the universe, and therefore understanding who he is in a profound way, and then knowing his place and the order of the universe, how he fits into what his purpose is, all of those amazing things. And those are really what we call the first principles. I made the very bold claim that it's not an exaggeration to say that the march of civilization parallels the vibrancy of traditional schools. And I want to build on that today. And I want to start by just posing the question, does man have a universal nature? I've already made sort of the claim that the liberal arts education is ordered to man's nature, and that's why it's the best education for every human being. I believe that wholeheartedly. And if that's the case, then there must be something about man that is universal, that this education will speak to every single human being. It's a question of man's human dignity. Before I jump into all the sort of particulars of how the West understood what it means to be a human being, I want to sort of talk about the big picture in history. This question isn't new. It didn't just come into existence today. We're not the only part of history that's wrestling with that question and what it means for civilization and for families. Right? For society, for America. We're not the only civilization in history that's dealt with that question. One of the very first epic stories in history out of Mesopotamia is about the king of Uruk, Gilgamesh. I'm not going into, I don't want to ruin the whole thing, but that story is about a prideful king who's not really sure how to govern people. No one can defeat him because he's so powerful. And his search for sort of true friendship in Enkidu. And then answering the question of his mortality, right? What is death, and what comes after that? And what does that mean for me? What is my place in the world? It's the very first epic story in history that we know of. Oftentimes, there's been this sort of question. I hear this a lot. I taught medieval history for 4 years, so I've heard this a lot. The medieval Christians baptized the Greeks, but I don't know if that's right. Right? So why do I say that? There's a great book that was written by a man named Warren Carroll called "The Founding of Christendom." That book is he goes through the history, the ancient history of the West and the world as it relates to Israel in the Old Testament. It's a really great book. There was one part that stuck out to me, And he talks about what happens after the diaspora, when the Jews are spread out all over the place. And you've got these very academic, intellectual Jews who are actually in Greece. And so the notion, he says, of Christians sort of baptizing this sort of biblical ethos into Christianity, maybe that's not exactly what happened, right? You had this group of intellectual Jews that were in Greece, and it seems to him that maybe they actually, it might have informed some of the conversations happening there in the 4th century BC surrounding some of those philosophers that we know and love, Aristotle, Plato, those sorts of things, right? Why does that matter? Because the idea of what it means to be a human being shows up in a way throughout the course of history, right? You've got the Mesopotamians trying to understand it. You've got the Israelites trying to understand it. You've got the Greeks trying to understand it. You've got the Romans trying to understand it. And then you've got Christianity, and now we're off into the modern world. And so there are some universal threads among all of them. And so it's important for us to think about them, right? Even when we get in sort of to the moving from the Greeks and the Israelites into the period of Christianity, we can see very clearly there's a sort of fight that goes on between the nature of men, right? And what is the fight? It's often between virtue and vice, the refusal, the acceptance of virtue, and making a choice to pursue a higher way of living by governing ourselves, and the refusal to accept that call, right? That's the conflict. I'll give you a perfect example. In the Middle Ages, kind of around the 8th or the 9th century, in England, the Saxons had become a sort of the sort of primary group of people that were governed England. I should say, I've mentioned this before, but I think it's important to put this into our minds. The historian Toynbee said once, "We're never more than a generation from barbarism." And that, I think that sort of outlines the conflict that I'm talking about within individual men. Will I pursue this higher way of living and govern myself? Or am I going to relegate my life to running from pain, seeking pleasure, and living a sort of a lower kind of a life in vice, right? That's, to me, that phrase, that's really what it says, right? It's that statement that he's making. And so going back to the Saxons, there's this very visual, at this point in history, this sort of very visual way that this sort of played out. The Saxons were literally savages, literally barbarians. And then they discovered Christianity. They, were baptized. But the point of that isn't so much Christianity as it is they decided that they were going to pursue a virtuous life, a higher way of living. They were going to begin to govern themselves. Now, the kind of people they were the kind of people that would kill their own family members for power and land, or that would sacrifice their children prior to their, decision to pursue a virtuous life. And around the 8th or the 9th century, Alfred of Wessex, Alfred the Great, he's called, because he was a magnanimous man, a man of great virtue, who governed well and loved his subjects and always sought the best for them, was ruling over Wessex when they conquered the chieftain Guthrum of the Danes. The Danes, much like the Saxons before them, were at this point in history sort of savages, men who preferred the pleasures of life above all other things and sacrificed children and all of those same things. Would kill their own family members for wealth and power and fame. Those were the most important things to them. In defeating them, some would say, well, the peace treaty that Alfred offered to them was proselytizing them, forcing them to come into the Christian faith. But I think if we just sort of step away from that idea for a second, and we just think about what happened here, you've got a group of people who were literally living in barbarism and who were brought out of the life of barbarism by the pursuit of virtue. Not on accident. It wasn't some sort of happenstance. It was a decision that they made by seeing what that life looked like, the happiness and the peace that came from it, and the unity, and deciding, yeah, that seems like a better life for me. And while it would be hard to change, I'm willing to make that change. And they've now encountered a group of people as they've started to move into that new way of living, like the virtuous life, who don't want to live that way. And they see what it looks like in reality again, and they don't want that to become a part of their civilization, right? And so the peace treaty is saying to them, look, in order for society to survive, we need you to pursue the life of virtue, right? Why tell all those backstories? Because at the heart of those backstories is really the philosophy that I want to get into, the more distinct sort of what does it mean to be a human being. The unity, the peace, and the happiness of society depend on man's desire to pursue wisdom, true wisdom, right? And Aristotle in the Nicomachean Ethic defines wisdom as this. He says, quote, "The wise man then must not only know all that follows on the first principles, but must also have a true understanding of those principles. Therefore, wisdom must be intuition and scientific knowledge, knowledge complete with the head of the most precious truths." And so there's a couple things just want to unpack there. I won't go into, I don't want to take it too far, but understanding the first principles, those sort of stories I just told you, Gilgamesh and Alfred of Wessex, and the Danes, the Saxons versus the Danes. The point of those stories is this: when man seeks to understand the first principles above all things, in his education, his pursuit of knowledge, he puts above all things the pursuit of the first principles, i.e., what does it mean to be human? What does that mean for my life? What are the best things? What's the way that I'm going to be the happiest man, the most joyful man? When I start asking that question and then begin to pursue it honestly, right, I put myself in a position where I can understand, I can know and understand the first principles that govern reality. And then another thing here that he mentions is scientific knowledge. I'm going to talk about that in greater detail here in a couple of minutes. But the point of that is that there are some objective truths about what it means to be a human being, objectively, for everybody. They're universal, right? And they apply to everybody. And those are the things that bring us together, that hold us together as human beings, that bind us together. And the primary way to understand that is that the human life that's pursuing goodness, virtue, is really inculcating in its soul those things that are necessary to love themselves well, to see themselves rightly in the universe, and then love their neighbor, right? That means society, their family, first and foremost, and then their country, right? Once that dissipates, then we fall into this tribalism, which I'll say more about. And the other point here I just want to make about this quote from Aristotle is that they can be known by man, and they ought to, if he is to live a life ordered to the superior things. Now, I've talked about this before. In the modern world, we tend to invert those things. We put the lowest things first. I'm going to talk about why I think we do that in a minute. I think that's philosophical. Our philosophical view of man is the reason why we do that. We invert them. But the most important thing to understand here is that they can be known by us. Everything isn't unknown. And even if a thing isn't material, if it's not a science that I can put under a microscope, it doesn't mean that I can't know it. And I think that's the point to take away. Anytime we start to talk about intellectual virtue or moral virtue in the modern world, all of a sudden people want to say, well, we can't know that. And I want to say, bottom line, if there are no human standards that we all share together, then we have to come to the reality that we're never going to have a civilization that is unified, and we're never going to have one that has peace. Because we'll never agree on the fundamental things. Proper decorum in a relationship, in a hallway. How do we act in the hallway? Well, we can act any way we want because there is no universal standard. That can't be true, right? Or all we would have is division. And so it's important that we understand, recognize, and accept the idea that these things can be known, and they ought to if we're going to live a life well ordered to the superior things. And that includes things like the virtue of true friendship, what it means to sacrifice for the good of another person, the virtue of wisdom, right? The intellectual capacity to know the truth, and especially about the first principles. The virtue of justice, what it means then to be a just man. And of course, the lasting disposition in the soul of happiness, one that can't be stolen or taken from you. And so I want to say, as we've talked about some of these things, I think what we struggle with here in the modern world, and what has always been the case throughout history, are these sort of different ideas about what the human being is. And so there's this one idea, and I just want to kind of present them for your consideration. One idea of man is what has been called in history Gnosticism. The idea that man is a spiritual being trapped in an evil body, right? And so this idea that there are these competing things that exist, that the body and material things exist, but man, that all of that stuff is bad. It's evil. The body itself and all material things are really just something that we're trapped in and that our soul needs to escape from in order to find happiness. It can't find happiness in this body, and there's nothing in this life that can make us happy. And that includes, they would have said, the most serious of them would have said, getting married, having children and families, babies, all of the things that go along with that, marital love, all of it would have been considered taboo, off the table, evil, not good at all. Eating food would have been considered actually kind of evil, a bad thing, material stuff that is no good for us, because our bodies are evil and material things are evil. And so there's a kind of higher knowledge that exists, and the soul is ordered to it, but also trapped in this body that keeps it from knowing it fully, and so has to get away from it. Death to these people, the most serious people, death would have been preferred. Like, there's no point in living if that's the case. Then on the opposite sort of, I think a sort of opposite view is materialism. The man is merely a body. He doesn't actually have a spiritual capacity, right? He's just firing synapses that he doesn't control at all, that he has no control over any of it, right? He's just this body. In this view, which is common to, I think, socialism and communism, a man's like a hammer or an axe, so he can be used for utility. What do we need? We can use him for that thing, right? And that's the only, this is the only thing he's good for. Let's use him for that. He's good at it. So, and in this view, I think slavery would be allowed. I think this is, our view of slavery in the modern world tends to be more racial, but slavery isn't new. It's existed from almost all of history. The view that man can be used as a tool and owned like an axe or a hammer. And for most of history, that didn't depend on race. It was more the product of, I would argue that it was more the product of a badly ordered view of the human person, right? That I could own a human being like I can own a tool. And in that case, I'm free to do with him as I wish because he's my tool. I could throw him on the floor. I can kick dirt on him. I can do whatever I want to in that view, because I don't really see the goodness in every man. I don't see a human being with a mind and a will and a soul, which we'll talk about in a second here. And so I think throughout the course of history, that is really more the way that slavery has been seen or executed. People were taken as slaves because they were from lower classes, because they were defeated in war and they weren't killed, so therefore they became property, right? And there was a view of that throughout the course of history. Okay, but I want to say that the West and the mission of the Liberal Arts Academy and the mission of the liberal arts throughout the course of history has always proposed a different view. And for this reason, it's the education that's proper to every man. And it's rooted deeply in wisdom and then the first principles of being and existence. So the best place to start then is with the mission statement. Our mission is to train the minds and improve the hearts of young people through a content-rich classical education in the liberal arts and sciences with instruction in the principles of moral character and civic virtue. Okay, train the minds. So let's start there. I want to say that this is the both and proposition of the West, and that it's been sort of hammered out and struggled through in almost every era, right? And starting with the time before Christ, all of those different groups, the Mesopotamians and the Greeks and the Israelites, right? Moving into Christianity and trying to hammer that out even more so there. There's this long synthesis of people trying to more and more deeply understand and articulate this view of man. And I think it's the right one, actually. So train the minds. Let's start there. The mind in Western thought is akin to, if you hear me ever say the intellect, that throughout the course of history, whether you're looking at the Israelites or the Greeks or the Christians or the Romans, you get this sense that there's a spiritual power that man has. It's called the mind, that is not just his brain, a material thing and firing synapses. It's more than that. It's the power to choose freely and to know and to understand, right? And what I mean by that is there are immaterial things that exist in the world, and we would never deny them. Love, friendship, wisdom, or we can't touch those things. They're manifest in human activity, but we can know them. We can talk about them, right? We can talk about what scientific knowledge is. All of those things are ideas. They're immaterial, and an immaterial function requires some capacity to do the function. So we'd say the first power of the soul is the intellect. It's an immaterial or spiritual power. That's a pretty common theme throughout the course of Western tradition. You find it in almost all of the most important authors trying to wrestle with the idea and define it. Am I saying that they've all said exactly the same thing about it? And the answer is no. I'm speaking generally here. But they're all sort of wrestling with it, whether it's Plato or Aristotle or Cicero or Aquinas. They're all wrestling with this idea and they're trying to define it more clearly. But the reality is that they would say there's a first principle about man. He isn't just a body. He's got a soul. And that soul has this immaterial power, and that is to know the truth, right? It's made for that as an end. That's the end of the intellect, is to know the truth. And so there's a responsibility laid on us then to be willing to pursue it, and that's improve the hearts. Throughout the course of history, the idea of the heart is associated in the West with the will, the power of the will to choose well, to choose the good. In order for so the will and the intellect are the two powers of the soul, and they work in harmony with each other. The will needs the intellect to know the truth, and the intellect needs the will to decide to pursue it. Because we can't say no. Oh, I don't like that. It's hard. Sounds like you want me to change. Ugh, I'm not doing that, right? That is real. That's a real world problem that happens all the time, right? And so the will is the power of the soul that's ordered to the good. When I say that the powers of the soul are ordered to something, what do I mean by that? I think it's important to sort of have an understanding. Do I mean that they're determined? You have no choice. And the answer to that is no. What I mean is something like this, and it's what I say to all the students when we start talking about freedom. What I often hear from students when I say, what do you think freedom is they say, it's the ability to do what I want to, when I want to whom I want to, without consequence. And that there sometimes is some indignancy when I suggest that human activity that you've just done is so grave that you actually need some consequence. Oh, but I'm free. Okay, yep, that's not really freedom. Here's what I mean by the will and the intellect is ordered to truth and the will is ordered to goodness. They're ordered to them as an end. As an end. It means it's the proper thing that they should be seeking for their human flourishing. If they're not seeking it, if that's not what they're doing, which they're free to choose to seek the truth or to do goodness, if they don't do it, the likely outcome is a sort of disaster, a breaking of the thing. Analogies aren't perfect, but here's the analogy I give. When I have this conversation with students, and I have, oftentimes I will ask them, how many of you have some kind of electronic device, a phone or an iPad or any of those things? Of course, the whole world raises their hand. And so I ask them that question. They all say yes. I say, you've used it probably for multiple things, but for example, to FaceTime your parents or your grandparents, or when you're at a distance, you're away from them, those kinds of things. Yeah. Would you ever take it to the bottom of your pool, submerge it there, and try to FaceTime your grandparents at the bottom of the pool? I wouldn't do that. Why wouldn't you do that? Now, of course, there are some that say, oh, well, there are some that are, you can actually get wet now, so I might do it. Fine, that's all fine. I'm talking generally speaking about electronics that have not achieved that technology yet. That might be an end some new products have been made toward, but generally speaking, most of them are not. So would you take it to the bottom and submerge it in the pool and FaceTime your grandparents there? No, I wouldn't. Why not? Because it would break. Oh, you mean it wasn't made for that? Yeah, but you could choose to do it, right? Well, yeah. Oh, okay. But you wouldn't because you know that it's not made for that. That's not what it was meant for. It was actually meant for something else as an end. It's not perfect, but that's sort of the way I mean the intellect is ordered to truth and the will is ordered to goodness. Can you do something else with it? Can you choose to do something that's not good? Of course. Can you choose not to pursue the truth or to know it? Of course. What's the end as a human being of not doing those things? Well, it's a great book. I don't remember the author. Mrs. Ellis, our campus advisor, is reading it right now. She keeps talking to me about it. It's called The Anxious Generation. And it's a book that's written about our children and what has happened to them as a result of staring at technology all day and being on social media at such a young age. So what can happen to them as a result of choosing contrary to the way we were made? Anxiety, despair. I mean, middle school students are insecure sort of by nature, but the degree to which they become very insecure as a result of anxiety and despair, because we haven't helped them to see this clearly, is exacerbated, right? Those are the kinds of things that can happen when we say, I'm free to do something that I'm not ordered to, but the end of that thing isn't going to be happiness. That's what I mean when I say only virtuous men can be happy. That's what I mean. Only virtuous men can be happy because their intellect wants the truth, even though it's hard, and their will wants to do goodness, even though it's hard. And that doesn't mean they get it right every single time, but it means that they're always, as the as the portico at Delphi said, know thyself. They're always trying to know themselves better, to seek the most superior things, and then to practice them in their life. Practical wisdom. Okay. All that's hard. And it is complicated, because I don't want to sound like a Gnostic and say, well, we're just spiritual creatures. All that's hard. And maybe it's complicated by the body, but it's also the body makes it good too, right? And so our knowledge has to go first through the body. We have 5 senses. So all of this can be a little bit complicated by the body because we learn and we acquire knowledge through our senses, right? We have those 5 senses: sight, touch, taste, sound, smell. So all those things are the way that we acquire knowledge through our body. We look at them, we hear them, we smell them, we touch them, all those things. The body is good. It's the way that we experience the world. It's the way that our knowledge comes to know the universe and our place in it through the body, right? However, there's also this other little thing that happens. The body can shrink from painful things. That means run from hard things like virtue. Ooh, that sounds hard. Oh, this makes me want to change. I don't want to do that. I think I'll run from it because it's too painful. We can do that, right? The body feels the pain of the conflict around it when it's trying to do something good and other people don't want it to happen, right? Or it can also pursue pleasure in a way that is disordered. So I love to hear the laughter of my peers in the classroom in the middle of class. And so I am a jokey jokester, and I always want to make them laugh. It doesn't matter if it's at someone's expense in the middle of class. It doesn't matter if it's appropriate or inappropriate. I love the pleasure that I derive from the laughter of the classroom, right? And so is it good to be funny? Of course it is. It's a pleasure to have joy and laugh and have good times with our friends and say funny things and enjoy all that. Does it need to be appropriate? Does it need to be in the right way at the right time for the right reason? Absolutely. Because if it's not, then it becomes a wrongly ordered pursuit of pleasure, right? And so we can do those two things. And sometimes that happens through our body. Aristotle says in the Nicomachean Ethics something very similar. For it is with pleasures and pains that moral goodness is concerned. Pleasure induces us to behave badly, and pain to shrink from fine actions. Hence, the importance of having been trained in some way from infancy to feel joy and grief at the right things. True education is precisely this. True education is precisely this. From infancy, training our children not to run from hard things, right? The difficulty of being a great man or woman, it is not some easy path, right? And we lie to them if we suggest that it is. Being a great-souled man or woman is an arduous lifetime journey for all of us. And we, as adults, first and foremost, have to be on that journey if we're going to lead our children to it. That's first, right? So we have to do that. So we don't want them shrinking from those things, the pain of change and pursuing the best things and all the virtuous things and ordering our life to them, the superior things. And then also to enjoy the pleasures of life, but in the right way, at the right time, for the right reasons. That's part of our job as adults, is to help them. And Aristotle says that job begins at infancy. And why? Because any of us who've had children can see clearly that they do not come out of the womb knowledgeable and absolutely good. That doesn't mean there's not goodness in them. Of course there is, and we see that in them, right? We see their natural inclination to goodness in our children. But how they order it and choose it, that becomes very complicated for them. I have 2 boys, and both of them have gone through, one is going through now, this sort of difficulty of rightly ordering them. They always will be, but it's very acutely obvious to me now because they're 3 and 5. And so all of the tantrums and all of the I don't want tos and all of those things surrounding some of the just normal everyday things that are good for them that we ask them to do, right? And so you can see that they require from a very young age the education of how to pursue pleasure. Because pleasure is good in the right way, in the right time, and for the right reason. But we have to order it well. And that requires our mind, our intellect, and our will to know the best things and to prefer the best things so that when pleasure comes along, we can govern how much of it and in what way we're going to pursue it. Or when a task comes along that's difficult, that is calling us to be great, to execute, to inculcate the virtues and to live them out, we don't run from it, right? That's a lifelong journey that begins at birth and has something to do with our understanding of the first principles about what it means to be a human being. I go back to those stories at the beginning, and I would argue that is what we were seeing with in those stories, whether it was Gilgamesh or whether it was Alfred of Wessex. What we saw in them was that they grew from barbarism to a deeper understanding of what it means to be a human being, how to pursue pleasure and pain in life, and then govern it well. And not perfectly, but well, so that they were living good lives, better lives, a virtuous life. And I would argue that's essential for us to understand. Now, in all of that understanding of what it means to be a human being, what has to happen then once we say, okay, Mr. Garcia, I accept what you're saying about being a human being. That sounds good to me. I'll take it. Maybe you're right. I'll at least think about it. Maybe I'll give it a thought or two. Then we have to say, okay, fine. If that's the case, then aren't there some standards? And so for most of history, there has been this standard by which we have lived. And we find that standard today kind of disappearing from our consciousness. And I think it's important that we sort of try to rediscover it. That standard is a standard that was not foreign to the founding fathers of America. We find it in the Constitution, and that standard, whether or not, look, we may agree and disagree about how the founders really understood the natural law and whether we all agree about the principles and all those things, and that's fine. That's a discussion for a different day, and maybe we'll even have it on the podcast. But just generally speaking, for most of history, there's been this sort of discussion about if this is what it means to be a human being, then there must be some standards, and at least those first standards we think are the natural law. And what does that mean? And so that means there's a law written into nature that is universal to every person. So the first part is this is what it means to be a human being. The body and a soul, they're both good. I have a mind and a will. They're superior to my body and my 5 senses. And those 2 things have to govern my desire for pleasure and pain. Great. So then maybe there are some other things, practical reason, the laws of nature, things we can see, standards that are important for us to know, right? So that we can live well together. One of the first ones is that life is good. Being itself is a good thing, right? That means that we have a very natural desire to live and to be alive and for the goodness of our own lives. And we really don't, generally speaking, when we're healthy, run around hoping someone will take our life from us, right? We desire by nature to be alive, which is why Gilgamesh went on that journey, right? Death terrifies me. Well, I don't understand it. I need the answer so I don't have to live this life in this weird way, always terrified of death, because I have this natural desire to live and I never want to die. That's a natural thing, I think, for most, generally speaking, for most people who are living in a healthy way, right? So that's the first principle, that we desire life. right? And we can kind of see that, I hope, most of us, sort of naturally, if we were walking home from work or out to our car and a group of terrorists jumped out from behind the car and wanted to attack us, most of us would not have to reason to the existence of a government-imposed law against doing harm to human beings. Right? We wouldn't have to stand there and think in our minds, this looks dangerous. I'm not sure what's happening. I wonder what I should do. What should I do? What should I do? Oh, you know what? I think the government wrote a law that says they're not allowed to do this. Maybe I should either fight or flee. It's not necessary, right? Because like the animals, right, we have those same very natural instincts to preserve our life, right? There's a higher instinct, right? We can think about how important it is and then write a law saying that it's not okay to do that, right? The lions and the zebras don't have laws, right? The zebras didn't get together and say, we should write a law and a constitution that makes life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness the greatest thing ever. And therefore, the lions will never chase us down and claw us to death again. They didn't do that because they can't. Now, they do have the instinct, the natural ability to run, right? And try to preserve their life. The same way, we should be able to see that the goodness of life is natural. We don't want to have anyone harm us. And instinctively, without having to reason to the law, we get that desire to fight or flee in time of danger, right? And that desire, that natural desire, is what has led to men saying it's rational and reasonable to believe that we shouldn't be doing anything to take. That's a standard, right? I think it's the first standard, and I think I start there because I'm pretty sure it's the one that we can the moral standard that every person can agree on. Innocent life should never be under attack, ever. I think that's a principle that we can all agree on, right? No one has the right to harm another life in any way that's innocent, right? Any innocent person. We should all be able to see that. I think that's the first one. Okay, so that's one precept, a common precept of the natural law. Derived from that, then, is that good is to be done and evil to be avoided. If this is a principle, it seems basic to me, and we should all understand it, but this is the whole purpose of the pursuit of virtue and the superior things in the higher life. This is the basis for all of it, and the rejection and the resistance of vice, right? And the attachment to pleasures and the running from pains. Have to rightly order them. And then the other one that I want to talk about, there are several others, but the other one that I want to talk a little bit about is knowledge. The knowledge of the truth. Man is made by nature to know things, right? And it follows on these two first principles. His life is good. It should be preserved, right? And good is to be done and evil is to be avoided. From the very beginning of our life, we pursue knowledge just by nature. And you can think of this, especially if you have children. When you have children, you immediately recognize you are the first teacher of those children because they are looking at you every day, and everything they do and say is really an image and a mirror of you, right? And anyone who has children recognizes this. It doesn't take long for children to begin speaking gibberish, right? Because they hear you talking to them. And then sometime as you're moving through their life, all of a sudden they say their first word. And you're so excited about this because they've acquired this knowledge through learning from you. And they desire it. And because they never stop trying, right? And they keep trying to figure it out. And then pretty soon they've got more words. Then all of a sudden a sentence that makes some sense. And then pretty soon you're communicating with them and they're using words to convey their thoughts and emotions and their desires, right? And what they understand and know, the highest things, right? And then all of a sudden they're learning Latin and they're playing the piano and they're doing all these things, right? This is the human nature, made for knowledge, naturally desiring it, right? It's a great good. These are the common threads that bind human beings together, right? This sort of universal things that we can know because of our intellect and our will, what it means to be a human being. I think it's fair to say that the founders, regardless of whether we think everybody, would define every single word in the same exact way, which is, again, a conversation for another day, were liberally educated and had some understanding of everything that I have just said. And I'm going to say that with confidence, and then I'm going to read this to you out loud from the founders. You'll all recognize it. We hold these truths to be self-evident, first principles that can be known. That's what self-evident means. That all men are created equal. That there's some dignity among human beings. That's a self-evident first principle, it seems that they believed. That they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. That these rights that we have are not from the government. Government doesn't give us our rights. They come from something much higher, right? That's what they believe. They're natural. They're built into the very fabric of creation in the universe, and that they don't come from the government, right? There's something that we can know that's higher than us, and we should be ordering our lives to that thing, which is good and true and virtue, and then trying to live in that way. And that among these are life, the goodness of life, right? That life is to be preserved, liberty, freedom. Now, in the modern world, rugged individualism has sort of become the definition of liberty in this vein. I'm going to argue that is not the way the founders understood liberty at all. They understood it exactly the way I've just explained it to you, that the will is ordered to the good. And I'll kind of make that a little clearer here in a minute. Liberty, true freedom, pursuing the good, and the pursuit of happiness, right? As an end. Happiness is the end that comes from our understanding that life is good, it is to be preserved, and that we must use our freedom well in order to live well in our families and in America, to bind this country together in unity. And that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. The purpose of the government is to protect the natural rights of the citizens so that they can be united in a peaceful, unified society. That's the job of the government. It's not to erase them. It's not to redefine them. It's actually to make sure that you are able to exercise them. That's the purpose. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, right? We ask them, please be in this role, take this office, do these duties, protect our rights so that we can preserve our families and live a happy life. And that's their job, right? Preserve the first principles, because they're self-evident. That's the job. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its power in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Right? That's how serious the founders thought the first principles, being self-evident of man's nature, the first principles of man's nature, being self-evident, must be at the foundation of any government, right? They weren't enamored with every single style of government. I often say this, and it's important for us to remember, why do we have to be culturally literate? Why do we have to understand history? Here's why. The Greeks were a pure democracy. Not so great. The Romans were a republic. It was okay. And England was a constitutional monarchy. When you look at America, it seems reasonable for me, and hopefully to you, to believe that they were culturally literate. What do I mean by that? They understood history. They saw what happened in history and they said, there was something good in democracy, there was something good in the republic, and there was something good in the constitutional monarchy. How can we take those things and build the greatest civilization in history? And at the foundation of all of those things, we think is the protection of what it means to be a human being. And we have to understand that. That's one of the most important things that we do. Briefly, just want to then talk a little bit about knowledge, because I think it's an important thing for us to understand and the way that it was understood in history. Science comes from the Latin word scientia, which means knowledge. In general, then, science is an organized body of knowledge which has the aspect of illuminating one or another aspect of the world in which we live, nature. For Aristotle, it really meant a demonstrable knowledge of causes. Okay, so just for bullet points, a science is an organized body of knowledge. That means it isn't just biology that's science, right? Philosophy can be a science, right? There's an organized body of knowledge there. The basis for any science is the first principles of that science, right? And so we're looking at philosophy. There are things that we talk about, whether it's metaphysics or those sorts of things, that want to get to what the first principles are in the order of the universe. And then from its first principles, right, and this is what we've been talking about, the first principles, what does it mean to be a human being? A science constructs the superstructure of derivative principles and laws, right? So in order, first and foremost, we have to say, what does it mean to be a human being? What are the standards that accompany that thing? And then how do we establish laws in society based on that? And so that's an important way to understand knowledge. Okay, why does all this matter? In De Anima, Aristotle says, indeed, an acquaintance with the soul would seem to help much in acquiring all truth, especially about the natural world, for it is, as it were, the principle of living things. Aristotle talks about the person in the Nicomachean Ethic and society in the Politics as if they were living organisms. And he speaks about them in the very same way. So the first part that has to happen is we have to understand what it means to be a human being. Why? Because if we don't, then we can't live in civilization with each other. We won't understand who we are. We won't understand the right way to avoid pleasure and to pursue hard things, pain, right? Not to shrink from it. We won't. And if we don't, then a unified, peaceful society is going to be very difficult to bring into existence. And in the modern world, I've talked about these two competing ideas, Gnosticism and materialism, and a lot of those things have reached into the modern world, and we see these sort of differences in what it means to be a human being, often, especially when we start talking to each other about how should we deal with children and those kinds of things, right? Psychology. Modern psychology in the modern world has sort of taken the view, it seems, in most cases, generally speaking, I'm not saying every single psychologist, generally speaking, that we are going to deal only with those things that we can see happening on the outside, and we'll figure out how to make them go away. But we're not going to figure out what it means to be a human being and try to help them figure out how to deal with pleasure and pain, because training children in that way is really hard. That's what we do. It's called the sculpting of the human soul. It's the hardest work, right? It requires time and energy and patience. And you have to keep going back and retraining them, sometimes in the exact same thing you trained them in yesterday. It's necessary. But in modern psychology, what we now see very often, we deal with it in the schools all the time. My student has X thing, disability, therefore he cannot do this thing. He cannot. He's not able to anymore. His will is broken, doesn't work at all. He's not free. He can't choose. We hear it all the time. I hear it all the time. The etymology of this word, psychology, has its root in two Greek words. Suke is the first part. That part is translated simply soul or life principle. Soul or life principle. The very foundation of psychology has to do with sculpting the soul, understanding what it means to be a human being deeply and profoundly inside, and then doing the hard work of trying to help sculpt that soul. That's the first part. And then logos, which is often translated as a sort of rational communication or a word, assertion, principle, thought, reason, account, those kinds of things. So it's the study of the human soul and the life principle and its rationality. I think that's the best way to understand psychology. The rational soul, and therefore, how do we help to move that thing? It's one of the most difficult works in all of human life is to help mentor and move souls into the right way of understanding pleasure and pain and seeking wisdom, right? So we would say it's an intellectual discipline or science devoted to the study of the rational principle of life. Having said that it's the rational principle devoted to the study of life, this is not an uncommon study throughout the course of history. Absent all of those things that I've said and our understanding of human nature, our desire for it, our desire for the good, our understanding that the human being is a body and a soul with five senses and an intellect and a will ordered to the pursuit of truth and goodness, absent of all those things, we could start to think about man in a different way. We might start to think that he's material. We might start to think that his body is bad and we shouldn't eat cows because they're bad. We might start thinking some of those things. And it's important that we understand that balanced thing. And philosophical psychology has been trying to do that for most of history. The point of this pursuit is the understanding of human nature. We're able to consider the essence of the person, the humanity. If we're not able to do that, if we don't have this view, we can't consider the essence of humanity. If we can't consider the first principle, then how do we decide how we're even going to educate them? How do we decide what the standards are for living together in a society, in a civilization? Then we're also unable to determine the causes and the effects that we may observe, right? We can't even really guide a child, right? If we see a child pursuing pleasure in the wrong way in the classroom, who has this desire to have his friends laugh at him all the time, and we're not able to understand that there's something good in being funny, but he's taken it too far. We call that excess, right? Too far. It's gone in excess of what the virtue really is. Then we can't help direct him back to the mean and the good, which is the central way of the virtue, right? The right way in the right place at the right time for the right reason. That's what we mean when we say getting to the mean of the virtue. And then we're also unable to really have a sincere conversation about the end of the human person. I think that it's difficult because we think that happiness, joy, really is abstract, no definition, not concrete. And I would argue that that's not true. It's the result of the pursuit of the good life, of happiness. Happiness is the result of the pursuit of the good life, of virtue, wisdom, friendship, seeking to become the magnanimous man. And if we can't do any of those things, then we can't effectively lead children to truth and goodness and beauty. And I would argue that would be a reason why we might see anxiety and despair in the children. And if we don't want that for them, then from infancy, as Aristotle says, we have to begin leading them on the very difficult course of pursuing pleasure and pain in the right way and seeking the mean virtue in all of these human activities. This is why we educate children the way that we do. All of this, coming to the end here. Pedagogos, from the Greek, pedagogy is derived from, that's the Greek word that pedagogy is derived from. And paidos means child, and agogos means leader or leading. So it's to lead a child to his proper end. The teacher has to begin with a clear understanding of what a child is, what it means to be a human being. And then if he does that, he'll have an equally clear understanding of that person's end, which is happiness, right? Knowledge, safety, the pursuit of true freedom, which the end of our will is goodness. That's what where true freedom lies, right? Ben Franklin said that the less virtuous a society is, the more in need of masters it becomes. Why? We think so often of material slavery, but the real slavery of our time is this sort of spiritual slavery that we fall into when we fail to seek the right end, the virtuous life that our will is ordered to and our mind is ordered to, the truth and the goodness that we can know and pursue. There's a slavery that comes about as a result of that. And so the pedagogy, pedagogos, the leading a child to its proper end, begins primarily with our understanding of what it means to be a human being in the first place and our love for the dignity of human life. If we have that, we can then teach from infancy to adulthood children how to pursue the right things in the right way for the right reasons at the right time, which will lead to their human flourishing, their happiness, and their goodness. This idea about education is a fairly universal one. I'm not sort of making any of this up. It's really found throughout the course of the Western tradition. You hear it in all these different places. You hear it in the Plato and Aristotle, and you hear it in Cicero and Aquinas and the medievals. And even not that long ago, I found this very beautiful quote about education from Benedict XVI. He says, the goal of education is the student himself, for the student himself to form his mind and character, right, his intellect and his will in such a way that he can live his whole life, so far as possible, in a way that is consistent with the truth about himself as a human being. And he would go on to say, created in the image and the likeness of God. That's not too far away from the founders, right? All men are created equal, right? They were given these rights, unalienable rights by God, and it's the government's job to protect them. Question today is, do we recognize them? Do we think about them? Are we willing to pursue those things in the most superior way? The consensus of the West, I think, is that man is made for great things. And throughout history, we've seen this in every era. Often I say we study history not because it was perfect, right? If we have to say, oh, well, we can't study that period in history because there were all these bad men, what could we talk about? We can't talk about the modern world even. There are many things in the modern world that are equally as bad as the things that have happened in history, right? Why do we study history? For the good that has come of it. We look at the Greeks and their foundation of their building of democracy and their building of some of the first great schools in the West. And then we look at the Romans and their sense of piety and their love of country, family. And then you have medieval Christianity who built universities and hospitals and all of those different things, right? And so we see in the Renaissance for the great architecture and the art, all of those different things, the times in history where great things happened. The West is made for great things. I think that's the consensus, right? And that it's because of the first principles, who man is, what he was meant to be, and what he's capable of. And understanding that and cultivating in the hearts of children and human beings a true love for the pursuit of excellence in the intellectual life and the moral life. It's a hard life, right? It's not easy. we often want to sell it as if it were some easy thing. Everybody's good. But the case is not such. The case is that in order to be good, we have to love the right things, want to learn them, and then pursue the right things because we love them. Right? That's the case. Man has to then pursue the right things, the first principles, which are self-evident, according to the founders, intellectually and morally. By morally, I mean practically. How do I choose well? Prudentially, how do I make good judgments about the life that I'm going to lead? When he does this, I would argue that he has unity and peace, and civilization flourishes. And this, I think, is the witness of history. And when he loses sight of the truth of man's nature and our common bond in virtue, it collapses. Barbarism is never more than a generation away, because without the wisdom to embrace man's nature and inculcate virtue in our souls, goodness and unity can be lost, and discord and tribalism would prevail. Thanks for sticking around. Until next time, sapientia operibus vindicata.